Screencast for anatomy and physiology is over the different sections of the brain. The brain is made up of 4 sections. I will color code them with my highlighter. So the cerebrum is this whole upper section here that I'm showing you in yellow. We'll talk a little bit more about the functions of that. That's where you're going to find ventricles 1 and 2. Diencephalon I'm going to show you here in purple. This is this middle section of the brain, deep on purpose. It is very important, and it is where a lot of control centers are found in the brain. The cerebellum I'm going to show you here in green is this section. It's a lobe of the brain that is found inferior to the cerebrum. And then the brainstem I'm going to show you here would be officially this bottom portion of the brain, which is the beginning of the spinal cord. Once the spinal cord exits the foramen magnum, then it's officially called spinal cord. An electroencephalogram, if we break it down into its root words, electro meaning electricity, encephalo meaning brain, and gram would be a chart, allows us to monitor brain activity. And so if we feel that there's a neurological imbalance, we can run an electroencephalogram or EEG that can allow us to be able to monitor brain activity. So the cerebrum, shown here earlier in the yellow highlighted section, is the largest part of the brain in humans, and its function is integration. So if we're going to be thinking about all of the sensory that comes in and all the motor that is going to come out of the brain, then the cerebrum does the largest amount of integration when it comes to the functions of the brain. It's also the area for higher order processing, learning, memory, and language and speech. So it has 2 major functions, integration and then higher order thinking. And we talked a little bit about evolution of the cerebrum, and primates by far of all the different animal groups have the largest cerebrum. You have 2 different sides to the cerebrum. You have a right side and a left side, and it's going to be right based on your current right side of your brain. So when you're looking at it, this is going to look like the right hemisphere, but it's not. That's actually the left hemisphere. So when you're talking about the brain hemispheres, you have to talk about them based on your own body. They are separated. They are 2 separate hemispheres. The right side is primarily responsible for integration of the left side of the body, and the left side is primarily responsible for the right side of the body. I know that sounds confusing, but there is a crossing over that occurs. This structure here, shown in beige, is called the corpus callosum, and it's what allows the right and the left to work together. If you look at it from the side, from a side dissection, here's the corpus callosum, and it looks rather small. But if you actually look at it from the front view or the back view, you can actually see that it's butterfly shaped. So the corpus callosum is the bridge between the right and the left side. A fissure is a very, very deep groove in the central nervous system, and so this would be a fissure right here, and this fissure separates the right and left sides of the brain. It's one of the deepest fissures. A convolution is a ridge that's found on the surface of the brain. So when you look at the surface of the brain, you can see that there are ridges. Those are called convolutions, also known as gyri. And then in between each of the convolutions will be a shallow groove, and that's called a sulcus. So when you look at the brain, you can see the convolutions, and then you can see the sulcus in between the convolutions. And then a very, very deep division would be a fissure. The cerebral cortex is made out of gray matter, and it is found on the surface of the brain, and that's where we talked about intelligence. We talked a little bit about Einstein, and his cerebral cortex was rather thick. So then let's talk about the different lobes of the cerebrum. So the major lobes of the cerebrum we'll show here. Here's the frontal lobe. And so when it comes to the frontal lobe is where we're going to control all of our body movements. We call that the primary motor area. Also where we're going to control our speech. It is also going to be responsible for allowing us to be thinking about critical thinking. Critical thinking happens in our frontal lobe. And then you have 2 parietal lobes. So here we can see the parietal lobe on the left, and then on the other side would be the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe is responsible for allowing you to be able to interpret sensory. So when something feels sticky, when something feels soft, when that was loud, being able to interpret happens in the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe is also responsible for taste. Occipital lobe, I'll show here in purple, that's in the back side of the brain, and it is primarily known for your visual centers. So you being able to see something and recognize it, recognize someone's face, all has to do with the parietal lobe. And then finally shown here in green is the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is primarily responsible for being able to interpret and understand hearing. We can also find the speech area in the temporal lobe. We're going to mark through that. If you look at the brain and you look at where you would wear a headband, okay, this area is shown here. If you were to put a headband on your head, this area is the primary motor area, and it is part of the frontal lobe, and it is responsible for allowing you to make movements in these parts of the body. So it's showing you here, highlighted in blue. It is showing you here on the brain where it's part of the frontal lobe. It allows you to be able to cross your legs. It allows you to be able to use your trunk if you were doing yoga. It controls the movements of your fingers, facial expressions. It's called your primary motor area. The primary motor area is your primary somatosensory area, shown here in orange, and it is responsible for the interpretation of all the sensories that's coming in from the body. So if your leg feels heavy, if your arm is numb, if you are raising your eyebrows, if you feel a crumb on your lip, being able to do that, that's all part of the parietal lobe, shown here in orange, again, right behind kind of where you would wear a headband normally. All right, so now we are going to skip over the section having to do with association areas of the brain, and we're going to go straight to the diencephalon. The diencephalon is buried deep inside the brain because it's a super important part of the brain. This part of the diencephalon is called the thalamus, this area right in here shown in red. And the thalamus is the relay or hitching station of the brain. So anything that would come in through a spinal nerve pair that would come up through the brainstem would hit the thalamus. And if it has to do with seeing something and recognizing it, it would go to the occipital. If it had to do with critical thinking, like you were taking a test in geometry, if it had something to do with interpreting a sensory sensation, then it would go to the parietal. That is called the thalamus. Right below it is a section called the hypothalamus, shown here in blue. The hypothalamus is super important as being a control center for hunger, thirst, sleep, body temperature, and water balance. So if you were dehydrated, your body would be able to tell you that. If it was approaching lunchtime, your body would be able to tell you that. The pineal gland shown here in the brain is an organ that is responsible for sleep and wake. It releases a substance called melatonin. And then hanging down below the brain is a section of the nervous system called the pituitary gland, which is the master gland. It works with the endocrine system to help you with all your hormones. Shown here in purple, which is found near the diencephalon, is the limbic system. The limbic system has a number of different parts. It is responsible for controlling rage, pain, pleasure, and sorrow. It also is your innate control of survival, so understanding how to take care of yourself. It's also responsible for learning and memory. Specifically, the hippocampus is responsible for converting short-term memories into long-term memories for learning. The cerebellum is a portion of the brain that sits inferior to the rest of the brain, and its job is to create posture and balance as well as coordinated movement. So if you were learning how to play the piano, or if you were learning a new dance, or if you were learning how to play a sport, you would use the cerebellum in order to become better at that sport One cool thing about it is that it's mainly gray matter, but on the very middle, it's white matter that looks kind of like the branches of a tree. And so that is referred to as the arbor vitae, or tree of life. And that's just a cool feature that you'll see when you dissect it. And then finally, the brain stem has three major portions. The upper portion shown here is the midbrain, and the midbrain works with the thalamus as the relay center for the brain. So if we have to send a message to a particular lobe, the midbrain works with the thalamus to do that. The pons region of the brain, which is shown here, is a relay center into the cerebellum. So if we're trying to learn how to play the piano, then the pons works together with the cerebellum in order to create coordinated movement. And then finally, the very bottom portion of the brain, shown here in yellow, is the medulla oblongata. And it is very important to controlling your heartbeat, your breathing, whether or not your blood vessels need to contract or open up or close. It's also the center for vomiting, coughing, sneezing, hiccups, and swallowing. Okay, that's it.